Imagine a map of the world. Okay, now picture that map wasn't drawn by, actual geographers, but maybe by poets, novelists, politicians, people putting their own biases and ideas onto it. Edward Said's Orientalism basically shows how this region, the Orient, was largely, invented by the West, not really discovered.
Right.
So today we're doing a deep dive into this really revolutionary idea. It changed how we think about knowledge, power, representation, the whole lot.
And it's not just about one book, is it? It's more like a whole framework of thinking built up over centuries. Yeah. What Said calls a discourse.
The discourse, right.
And this discourse shaped how the West saw the Orient, this huge, incredibly diverse area, Middle East, parts of Asia, all lumped together. So our mission today, unpack where this came from, how it changed, and the impact it still has. It might actually surprise you how much these invented ideas still shape things.
Okay, so let's dig in. If the Orient wasn't just found on a map, how did this imagined place even come about? How did it go from imagination to something people treated as real?
Well, it started with what Said calls imaginative geography. Think way back, long before detailed maps or lots of travel. The West was already imagining the East.
Okay.
Think classical Greece. Aeschylus, right. His play of the Persians. Europe shown as strong, articulate. Asia, defeated, far away, different. And then Euripides' Bacchae sort of adds this idea of the Orient as maybe dangerous, seductive, full of excesses that challenged Western reason. These early stories, they laid down these foundational ideas, painting the East in these really broad strokes, often negative ones.
So a single story, or maybe just one encounter, could end up shaping the whole perception. Said uses that amazing example, doesn't he? Flaubert meeting an Egyptian courtesan, Kuchak-Hanem.
Yeah, that's a key one. He writes about her, speaks for her, presents her as typically Oriental.
But she never spoke for herself like that.
Exactly. And Said argues this wasn't just a one-off. It set a pattern. The West speaking for the East, defining it on its own terms.
Okay, and how did this way of thinking, this textual attitude, as he calls it, get so powerful?
Well, Said has this great analogy. Imagine you read in a book that lions are fierce. Okay, then you see a lion, yep, it's fierce. So you believe the book more.
Right, makes sense.
But then what if the book also tells you how to deal with that fierce lion? And you try it, and it actually works.
Then the book becomes incredibly authoritative.
Precisely. The text gains this immense power. It suggests texts don't just describe reality. Sometimes they feel like they create it for the reader. They become more trusted, maybe, than even what you see yourself.
And this wasn't just theory locked away in libraries. It had real-world consequences.
Absolutely. This textual understanding directly fueled actions. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 points to this as huge.
Why that specifically?
Because Napoleon's preparations, his whole approach, were almost entirely textual, based on ideas, myths, things pulled from earlier writings about Egypt, not really based on the Egypt that was actually there. And he brought scholars with him, didn't he? Orientalists, to basically help manage and justify the whole thing. He even told the Egyptians, "We are the true Muslims."
Incredible. That really shows the links Said draws between knowledge and power, doesn't it?
It really does. Look at Arthur Balfour, the British politician. He was justifying occupying Egypt.
Oh, okay.
And he argued British power, there wasn't mainly military or economic, it was. It was their knowledge of Egypt. He actually said this knowledge let them dominate it.
Because we know it as we know it, something like that.
Exactly. It exists in a sense as we know it, denying its own reality, its autonomy, because their knowledge defined it.
So what did that actually look like for people in Egypt? Lord Cromer, he was the British guy in charge for ages.
Yeah, for decades. And Cromer, he didn't hide it. He saw Egyptians, Orientals, as human material he governed.
Oof.
And his views came partly from being there, sure, but also heavily from reading these standard Orientalist books. He'd say things like the Oriental thinks and acts exactly opposite to the European, just these huge generalizations.
He even dismissed Egyptian nationalism, right? Called it exotic, not homegrown.
Yeah, like it couldn't possibly have come from Egyptians themselves. It had to be imported. It really denies any agency.
So how does this fit into the bigger picture of empire?
Well, Cromer saw the empire as this harmoniously working machine. Power flows out from the West, takes what he called mere Oriental matter, people, resources, even local knowledge.
And turns it into more power for Britain.
Exactly. Converts it into useful stuff for the central authority. The expert, the Orientalists, their job was to translate that Oriental matter into something the empire could use. It wasn't just understanding, it was processing, exploiting.
And this sort of scientific approach, defining the Orient, it just kept going.
Oh, yeah. Sensei talks about Kissinger much later using this binary opposition, developed world, developing world, and often linking the West with like post-Newtonian precision and the East with a pre-Newtonian prophetic style.
Sounds neutral, but probably wasn't.
Not at all. Words like prophetic, disorderly, they get attached to the East. And that implicitly invites the West to step in, to control, contain, and otherwise govern, using its supposedly superior knowledge and power.
And sometimes it gets really extreme. That Harold Glidden essay from '72.
Oh, that's a stark example. The Arab world claimed to reveal the inner workings of Arab behavior.
For like 100 million people over 13 centuries.
Yep. 4 pages, double columns. And he cited 4 sources.
4. Wow.
And made these huge claims. Arabs value conformity. It's a shame culture. Objectivity is not a value in the Arab system. I mean, you have to ask, what kind of knowledge is that? What's its real purpose?
4 sources. That's efficient, I guess. But yeah, clearly not about accuracy. So, okay, we see how individuals push these ideas, but how did they get so locked in? How did they become institutional truth?
Well, they didn't just float around. They got institutionalized. Think of Sylvester de Saussy, a real pioneer in Orientalism. He basically created the field as we know it.
So
he saw his job as digging up, rescuing all this obscure material. He called it creating a technology of power. He didn't even leave France, but he ransacked the Oriental archives, brought texts back, then edited, annotated, arranged them, basically reshaped them.
So the interpretation became more important than the original.
Pretty much. Says over time, the Orient itself became less important than what the Orientalists made of it. The representation overshadowed the reality.
And this led to those summational statements you mentioned. Big generalizations.
Exactly. Any little detail studied could be used to prove some vast point about the Oriental character or mind, like taking one verse from the Quran and saying it proves ineradicable Muslim sensuality.
Wow, just extrapolating wildly.
Yeah, and the racial angle got really explicit and dressed up as science. Friedrich Schlegel, key figure in language studies, philology, he learned Sanskrit, but still called Semitic languages agglutinative, unesthetic, mechanical.
And the people who spoke them.
Different, inferior, backward. This linking of language and race, it became the foundation for a scientific subject matter. It cemented this hierarchy, but made it look objective, like scholarship.
It sounds like a really powerful framework. Could anyone break out of it, even critical thinkers?
Yeah, it was tough. Zed uses Karl Marx as an example. Marx clearly sympathized with Asian suffering under British rule.
Right.
But even his human sympathy, Zed argues, kind of evaporated when he tried to write about it. He fell back on the standard Orientalist language, Orientals, Asiatics, these abstract generalities.
So the language itself was like a cage.
Sort of a formidable censor, as Zed puts it, and suggests the framework was so pervasive it could almost chase away the sympathy, even for someone trying to be critical.
That's quite a thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did these ideas carry on, maybe change, after someone like Marx into the 20th century?
Well, building on that, it's interesting how things shifted, especially after World War II, in the U.S. particularly. Orientalism moved away from being mainly about old texts and languages, philology.
Towards what we now call area studies.
Exactly. And this shift was really driven by government, by strategic needs, Cold War politics,
So practical application.
Right. Oriental languages suddenly became working tools for oil companies, military personnel, technicians, not so much studied for their literature or culture anymore.
Yeah.
The why of the knowledge changed. It became much more about utility, about serving policy interests.
Which brings us to more recent times, and this has real implications for anyone, listening now, trying to get accurate information. Zed mentions surveys.
Yeah, finding just shocking levels of misinformation about Arabs and Islam in American textbooks, for example. And he points out how supposed experts can actually end up reinforcing stereotypes. He cites this 1967 report by a Princeton sociologist, Morrow Berger.
What did Berger say?
He basically concluded the Middle East didn't have many traits that would naturally attract scholars because of its, quote, intrinsic weaknesses.
Seriously?
Yeah. He essentially argued that without Western scholars like himself, the region would just be ignored because it's radically incapable of interpreting itself.
Wow. That's quite something. It really begs the question Say raises, when does scholarship just become propaganda or a justification for power?
Right. And Said critiques Bernard Lewis for this kind of thing. Lewis's book title shifting from The Revolt of Islam to The Return of Islam.
implying a kind of inherent, unchanging threat.
That's the implication Said draws. Lewis often analyzed things, trying to figure out why Muslims wouldn't just settle down and accept Israeli hegemony, for instance. Sometimes claiming their primary loyalty is always religion, making them hard to grasp in Western political terms.
And Said's point is that this kind of analysis,
it blinds its practitioners. It prevents them from seeing the actual complexities, the real political and social factors at play, because they're stuck in this Orientalist framework.
maybe the most worrying result of all this is how the Orient itself started to internalize these views, participating in its own Orientalizing.
That's a really crucial and sad part of the argument. You see Arab universities often using models just inherited from colonial times. And talented Arab students still feel they need to go to the US or Europe to study their own regions. And while there, they often end up learning and repeating the same cliches, the same Orientalist dogmas, instead of building truly independent viewpoints.
It becomes a kind of self-perpetuating cycle.
It really can. However, Said isn't entirely pessimistic. He does point towards a way forward.
Okay, how?
He highlights scholars who are self-critical, people like Jacques Burke or Maxime Rodinson. They had the rigorous Orientalist training, but they combined it with a real awareness of methodology, a constant questioning of their own assumptions.
So being aware of the potential pitfalls.
Exactly. Keeping a direct connection to the material, but always examining how they're looking at it, using insights from other human sciences to check their biases. It's about not just studying, but questioning how you study.
That makes sense. So ultimately, Said saw Orientalism as this huge failure, intellectually and humanly, creating this division, this opposition.
Yes, an irreducible opposition to these regions it labeled as alien. But crucially, he believed its power, its global dominance can be challenged. It's not inevitable.
Right.
So we sort of traced how this system of thought Orientalism, how it actively constructed and often demeaned the East, how it denied agency, spread stereotypes.
Yeah.
It's a really stark example of how ideas, once they get institutionalized, can take on this powerful life of their own, shaping reality for people.
So wrapping up, what's the takeaway for you listening? This deep dive, it's a really potent reminder, isn't it, that systems of thought, whether it's about a culture, a group, heck, even a scientific field, they can subtly twist the subject. They can blind the people using them.
Like mental handcuffs.
Exactly, like William Blake's mind-forged manacles. The answer, Said insists, isn't to just flip it and create an Occidentalism.
No, definitely not.
The answer is more about critical awareness, understanding how knowledge gets made, who makes it, and whose interests it might serve. So maybe the question to leave you with is, what hidden discourses of power might be shaping your view of the world right now? And how can you start to actively question them? Something to chew on until our next deep dive.